Hi all. In my previous audio video, I was talking about the early origin of cultural studies, and I have told you that it cannot be uh, said that something originated anew. It began on one fine day morning. Cultural studies began, or any theory in that matter. Any theory will be originated due to a zero or a break, and we have seen what kind of situations that led to the break of that led to the development of cultural studies, and we have discussed the major figures who worked behind or founding figures of this theory. So the figures like Raymond Williams, Richard Hogarth, and E.P. Thompson. So we have this video is a continuation of the same, and here Stuart says that in his essay Cultural Studies Two Paradigms, culture was the site of the convergence. So there are figures like Raymond Williams or E.P. Thompson, Hogarth, and new left movements and things like that. So the area of convergence was, or the site of convergence was culture. Okay, and then what this can lead to the question, what is culture then? The fact is that no single unproblematic definition of culture is to be found here. That is what he says. The concept remains a complex one, a site of convergent interests rather than a logically or conceptually clarified idea. This richness is an area of continuing tension and difficulty in the field, and it might be useful therefore briefly to resume the characteristic stresses and emphasis through which the concept has arrived at its present state of indeterminacy. You can focus on the word in bracket indeterminacy. So we cannot determine for sure the nature and features of culture under cultural studies, under the banner of cultural studies. So two main problematics are being discussed in the essay. So when we come to the discussion of culture and cultural studies, there are two main problematic, and which has been discussed in this essay. Two rather different ways of conceptualizing culture can be drawn out of the many suggestive formulations in Raymond Williams' Long Revolution. So this discussion is based on Raymond Williams' work Long Revolution. The first relates culture to the sum of the available descriptions through which societies make sense of and reflect their common experience. So culture is to be understood as the sum means the totality of the available descriptions through which societies make sense of and reflect their common experiences. So how we describe our own common experiences, or how we make sense of the descriptions of our own common experiences. This definition takes up the earliest stress on ideas, but subjects to a thorough reworking. The conception of culture is itself democratized and socialized. Here in this definition, the shared common experience, or how the common experiences are being made sense to ourselves. So there is this democratization and socialization of the entire concept of culture. It no longer consists of the sum of the best that has been thought and said, regarded as the summits of an achieved civilization, that ideal of perfection to which in an early usage all aspired. So if you look at the definitions or terms which Matthew Arnold, for example, used, he says that it is the best that is known and thought in the world. Culture is the best that is known and thought in the world. So there is something that is an achieved culture, and the best practices, the best among which can be categorized as culture. That is what Matthew Arnold says. So here such a selection and omission is not there when we say that it is a sum of the experience, some of the available descriptions through which we make sense of ourselves. That kind of a definition is more democratic and socialized. Okay, differing from the previous notions of culture or civilization. So even art, assigned in the earlier framework a privileged position as touchstone of the highest values of civilization, is now redefined as only one special form of a general social process, the given and taking of meanings, and the slow development of common meanings, a common culture. Culture, in this sense, is ordinary. So, if you even look at the literature or art, which is the ideal work, we have the notions of canon in literature. Only the best will be taken into consideration as an ideal artistic forms and all that. So that was the idea, a kind of a privileged kind of thing. But on the other hand, now the idea has been changed and it says that culture is ordinary. Okay, that is one of the titles of Raymond Williams' essay as well. And culture is ordinary, means every experience that we have as a society, even the common experiences, can be categorized or will be categorized under the term called culture. So, if even the highest, most refined of descriptions offered in works of literature are also part of the general process which creates conventions and institutions through which the meanings that are valued by the community are shared and made active, then there is no way in which this process can be hived off or distinguished or set apart from the other practices of the social process. So every experience matters, every shared activity is important, not just the selection of certain things. Since our way of seeing things is literally our way of living, the process of communication is in fact the process of community, the sharing of common meanings and thence common activities and purposes, the offering, reception and comparison of new meanings, leading to tensions and achievements of growth and changes. So everything will be taken into consideration. Accordingly, there is no way in which the communication of descriptions understood in this way can be set aside and compared externally with other things. If the art is part of society, there is no solid whole outside it, to which by the form of our question we concede priority. The art is therefore as an activity with the production, the trading, the politics, the raising of family. To study the relations adequately, we must study them actively, seeing all activities as a particular and contemporary forms of human energy. So everything is part of the human activity, and art and literature is just another activity, part of one culture. So in new historicism we say literature is embedded in history or literature in culture. So it is just as we have raising a family or political issues or trading, the production, literature is just another category in it. It is not something which stand as outside it and reflect upon us like in a mirror image or anything. It's not just an outside entity. It is part of our common experiences or our culture. If the first emphasis take that is the very primary very significant idea within cultural studies, and if the first emphasis takes up and reworks the connotations of the term culture with the domain of ideas, the second emphasis is more deliberately anthropological. So the first we have said that it is ordinary, things like that, and the second sense in based on which we make sense of the term culture is the anthropological idea of culture, and emphasizes that aspect of culture which refers to social practices. So there are anthropological sense in which we take it into consideration the social practices and identify it as culture. It is from this second emphasis that the somewhat simplified definition, culture is a whole way of life, has been rather too nearly abstract. Williams did relate this aspect of the concept to the more documentary, that is descriptive, even ethnographic usage of the term. But the earlier definition seems to me the more central one, in which way of life is integrated. The important point in the argument rests on the active and indissoluble relationships between elements or social practices normally separated out. It is in this context that the theory of culture is defined as the study of relationships between elements in a whole way of life. So this is the concept or the context in which a theory of culture has been evolved. Culture is not a practice, nor is it simply the descriptive sum of the most and folkways of societies, as it tended to become in certain kinds of anthropology. So you know what anthropologists do when they study culture. They will go to a society, a tribe or something, and they study the sums of the mores and folkways of societies. So it is threaded through all social practices, and is the sum of their interrelationship. So it is not just one aspect, it is through all social practices. Everything has to be taken into consideration and is the sum of the interrelationship of. The question of what then is studied and how resource itself. The culture is those patterns of organization, those characteristic forms of human energy which can be discovered as revealing themselves in unexpected identities and correspondences, as well as in discontinuities of an unexpected kind within or underlying all social practices. So we need to take into consideration the whole social practices and everything connected to it. The analysis of culture then is the attempt to discover the nature of the organization, which is the complex of these relationships. So culture has to be understood, the analyzed based on as an attempt to discover the nature of the organization, which is the complex of these relationships. There are multiple relationships and interrelationships, and we need to take into consideration all those. It begins with the discovery of patterns of a characteristic kind. One will discover them not in the art, production, trading, politics, the raising of families treated as separate activities, but through studying a general organization in a particular example. So we cannot study all these in isolation and come out with an analysis. Everything is interrelated, whether it is art or production, trade, politics, literature, everything is interrelated. Analytically, one must study the relationships between these patterns. The purpose of the analysis is to grasp how the interactions between all these practices and patterns are lived and experienced as a whole in any particular period. This is a structures of feeling or structure of feeling, and structures of feeling is very crucial in understanding Raymond Williams' conception of cultural studies or study of culture. Structures of feelings. We have talked about the dominant culture, residual culture or emergent culture, and in a particular society everything will be present. There will be a dominant cultural practice, and there will be a residual of the previous practice, and there will be an emerging cultural practice, and we need to take into consideration all these. We cannot simply focus on the base and superstructure model, as Marx said, and we cannot reduce everything to a in a mere economic reductionism is not possible. That is what he says. So it is easier to see what Williams was getting at and why he was pushed along this path if we understand that were the problems he addressed and what pitfalls he was trying to avoid. This is particularly necessary because the long revolution carries on a submerged, almost silent dialogue with alternative positions, which are not always as clearly defined as one would wish. So there are certain pitfalls and problems within the analysis of Raymond Williams in the work The Long Revolution, and it has been subjected to criticism from his fellow critics like Thompson and others. So there are silent dialogues which he has in. There is a clear engagement with the idealist and civilizing definitions of culture, which we have already discussed. Both the equation of culture with ideas in the idealist tradition and the assimilation of culture to an ideal prevalent in the elitist terms of the cultural debate. So we have already said in the previous video also, we have said there was a debate, okay, the high culture, the low culture, or mass culture. Such kinds of debate was there, and culture was considered as to be the best among them. So even such ideal position has been taken into consideration, and also the other part, okay. But there is also a more extended engagement with certain kinds of Marxism, which I have just mentioned, kind of Marxism, against which Williams' definitions are consciously pitched. So in order to understand Williams' position, we need to take it into consideration the aspect of Marxism as well. He is arguing against the literal operations of the base and superstructure metaphor. We have been discussing the base and superstructure model. So there is an economic base, and everything else is the superstructure based on which is formed or framed and shaped by the economic base. Such a model. So we need to take into consideration the ideas expressed by Williams from as an engagement with that kind of a Marxism. Okay, so which in classical Marxism ascribe the domain of ideas and of meanings to the superstructures themselves conceived as merely reflective of and determined in some simple fashion by the base without a social effectivity of their own. That is to say, his argument is constructed against a vulgar materialism and an economic determinism. So this is what economic determinism is. Economic aspects define or shape the culture or other aspects of life. He offers instead a radical interactionism. So what Raymond Williams is talking about is an interactionism. In effect, the interaction of all practices in and with one another, skirting the problem of determinacy. The distinctions between practices is overcome by seeing them all as variant forms of practices of a general human activity and energy. The underlying patterns which distinguish the complex of practices in any specific society at any specific times are the characteristic forms of its organization which underlie them all and which can therefore be traced in each. There have been several radical revisions of this early position. So this is the way he envisaged his ideas in the early versions of his thought, especially in the early part of long revolution, but it has been subjected to some kind of criticism within, and each has contributed much to the redefinition of what cultural studies is and should be. We have acknowledged already the exemplary nature of Williams' project in constantly rethinking and revising older arguments in going on thinking. Nevertheless, one is struck by a marked line of continuity through these seminal revisions. One such a moment is the occasion of his recognition of Lucien Goldman's work, and through him are the array of Marxist thinkers who had given a particular attention to superstructural forms and whose work began for the first time to appear in English translation in the mid 1960s. So Lucien Goldman was a French critic, and he was the disciple of Georges Lucas. Lucas was one prominent figure in the Marxian thought itself, and we can find some kind of an influence of Lucien Goldman's works in Raymond Williams and other Marxian thinkers. Okay. The contrast between the alternative Marxist traditions which sustained writers like Goldman and Lucas as compared with Williams' isolated position and the impoverished Marxist tradition he had to draw on is sharply delineated. But the points of convergence, both what they are against and what they are about, are identified in ways which are not altogether out of line with his earlier arguments. So Lucien arguments and other Marxian critics at that time were also trying to redefine some of the or change some of the aspects of the cruder versions of Marxism. Okay, here is the negative which he sees as linking his work to Goldman's. I came to believe that I had to give up, or at least to leave aside, what I knew as the Marxist tradition, to attempt to develop a theory of social totality, to see the study of culture as a study of relations between elements in a whole way of life, to find a way of studying structure which could stay in touch with and illuminate particular artworks and forms, but also forms and relations of more general social life, to replace the formula of base and superstructure with a more active idea of a field of mutually, if also unevenly determining forces. His own arguments in New Left Review. And here is the positive, the point where the convergence is marked between Williams' structure of feeling and Goldman's genetic structuralism. Okay, so both Raymond Williams' idea of the structures of feeling and Raymond Williams' idea of structure of feelings and Goldman's idea of genetic structuralism, all those have something in common. I found in my own work that I had to develop the idea of a structure of feeling, but then I found Goldman beginning from a concept of structure which contained in itself a relation between social and literary facts. This relation, he insisted, was not a mere matter of content but of mental structures, categories which simultaneously organize the empirical consciousness of a particular social group and the imaginative world created by the writer. By definition, these structures are not individually but collectively created. So that is the area where we need to focus. It is not an individual creation but a collectively created structures. The stress there on the interactivity of practices and on the underlying totalities and the homologies of similarities between them is characteristic and significant. A correspondence of content between a writer and his world is less significant than this correspondence of organization of structure. So Raymond Williams was trying to come out with an idea of culture in his works, especially Long Revolution and all that, but later he was influenced by, or he has to be understood by his engagement with the Marxism as well, and Marxist thinkers like Goldman and Lucas. And the second moment that we need to take it into consideration, a second such moment is the point where Williams really takes on board E.P. Thompson's critique of the Long Revolution. Okay, so E.P. Thompson also came out with some kind of a critique of Raymond Williams' work, E.P. Thompson, and later Raymond Williams take it into consideration that criticism as well, that no whole way of life is without its dimension of struggle and confrontation between opposed ways of life. So whenever we talk about a whole way of life, there will be some other ways of life as well, and attempts to rethink the key issues of determination and domination via Gramsci's concept of hegemony. And I think you are familiar with Gramscian hegemony, and they reworked based on hegemony, Gramscian idea of hegemony as well. This is a base and superstructure which I'll be sharing with you. I think, okay, let me check. It's a seminal one, especially in its elaboration of dominant, residual and emergent cultural practices, and its return to the problematic of determinacy as limits and pressures. So in the essay Base and Superstructure, Raymond Williams come out with an elaborated view of cultural practices, and he elaborated three different aspects of culture. One is the dominant or the mainstream culture, and the residual means old cultural practices still affecting the dominant culture, which may be acting as an alternative to the dominant culture. And there will be an emergent culture, which is a new cultural form coming on from this. Okay, so there are these three different aspects in any culture. Nonetheless, the earlier emphasis occur with the force. We cannot separate literature and art from other kinds of social practice in such a way as to make them subject to quite special and distinct laws. So what he is again coming to say is that art and literature is just like any other human activity. It cannot be studied separately. So in a society there will be different activities which together forms the culture, and literature and art just one part which makes up that culture of a society. And no mode of production, and therefore no dominant society or order of society, and therefore no dominant culture in reality exhausts human practice, human energy, human intention. And this note is carried forward. Indeed, it is radically accented in Williams' most sustained and succinct recent statements of his position, the masterly condensations of Marxism and literature. Then later revisions of Williams' own thoughts. He had come out with a work like Marxism and literature. Against the structuralist emphasis on the specificity and autonomy of practices and their analytic separation of societies into these discrete instances, Williams' stress is on the constitutive activity in general, on sensuous human activity as practice. From Marx's first thesis on Feuerbach and different practices conceived as a whole indissoluble practice on totality. Thus, contrary to one development in Marxism, it is not the base and superstructure that need to be studied, but specific and indissoluble real processes within which the decisive relationship from a Marxist point of view is that expressed by the complex idea of determination. So he again contesting that idea of base and superstructure in his essays. Okay, so what we need to take into consideration is Williams' conceptualization of the works like A Long Revolution, Marxism and literature, and the essay Base and Superstructure, and how he contested the Marxian idea of base and superstructure, his influence of Goldman and Lucas and other Marxian thinkers, and how he again incorporated and have engaged with the idealist traditions of culture. So these are some of the things that we need to remember at this point of time. Okay, so we will be continuing later. Thank you.